Wellesley-Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the Greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
Let me now turn to today's program, which is very special. And you can see that we're sort of in festive mode here with posters and a banner, and our speaker, Fredie Kay, who is dressed in white, which symbolizes the women's suffrage movement and the gaining of the vote for women in the United States. We are so happy to be able to have this particular program and to celebrate the women who fought so hard for a right that many of us unfortunately now take for granted. It's a right, actually, which still requires support. The United Nations, I think in 1979, passed a resolution that all women worldwide should be enfranchised, should have the right to vote. And the gaining of the suffrage is a very interesting story. You may not know, or maybe you do, that it took a very long time for certain countries to give women the right to vote. I mean, it's surprising. France, for example, did not enfranchise women till 1944. Switzerland, I think, was 1971. Switzerland was one of the latest, one of the last of the so-called developed nations to grant women the right to vote. One of the first to grant universal women's suffrage was actually New Zealand in the 1890s. And if you're at all interested in how this movement spread, I can send you the link to an article on the internet which gives a chart which explains how often it was partial suffrage, women over a certain age, women who'd been educated in a certain way. Women, I think in Canada, the first group of women to be enfranchised were those of French or British descent, and only gradually it became universal. Anyway, we're going to focus on the story of how American women won the right to vote. And our speaker is eminently qualified to take us through that amazing history. Really all her adult life, she has been involved with the political enfranchisement of women and their equality toward in the face of the law. Where did the law allow discrimination to occur? So she has been not only the founder and president of this amazing society to celebrate women's suffrage, but also an advocate for women's issues. She was educated at the University of Maryland, where she had a bachelor's degree in government and politics. She followed that with a master's in public administration from Harvard's Kennedy School, and topped it off with a JD from Georgetown University Law Center. So her education prepared her for this particular work. She began her career as an attorney with Goodwin Procter in Boston. She became deputy legal counsel for our governors, Michael Dukakis and then William Weld. She served as director of the Massachusetts Office of Dispute Resolution. She is a member of the Equal Pay Coalition and has also held a number of leadership roles in different organizations. Access to Justice Program, the Women's Vote Centennial Initiative, League of Women Voters, and the Jewish Community Relations Council. So she's founder and president of the Women's Suffrage Celebration Coalition of Massachusetts. And we are so honored to have her here today to speak to us. So please welcome Fredie Kay.
Good morning, everyone. Jillian, thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for speaking so much about the situation worldwide for women getting the vote. As Jillian said this morning, I'm going to be focusing on the United States story. Special thanks to Jillian Strang for inviting me and for making all the arrangements for this morning. It's great to be here. And it's also great to finally meet you. I also want to thank Mickey Golden for suggesting me to you. Mickey is sorry he couldn't be here this morning, and thanks to Bill Stanwood for his technical assistance, etc., and to the custodial staff and all others who helped with this morning's event. It's wonderful to be here with you today. A quick detour, I just want to mention about these panels that you see. These are called display panels, and they are from a collaboration project of the Women's Suffrage Celebration Coalition of Massachusetts, the WSCC. We are collaborating with the Commonwealth Museum. For any who don't know it, it's a part of the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office from the Office of the Archives and Commonwealth Museum. It's located across the parking lot from the JFK Library and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. So if you're ever there and you see this other building with brown stones, it's a fabulous building called the Commonwealth Museum. The archives are there. I believe that our copy of the Constitution resides there, and it's a terrific museum. We're collaborating with them to do these panels, which are once a month. We're doing a Suffragist of the Month. So this is just a sampling of the many that we have. We started this program a year ago, August. They're online on our website, which is suffrage100ma.org, which is on your materials and at the bottom here, and also on the Commonwealth Museum website. And I think you'll enjoy scrolling through and reading about each of these. So I'd like to begin my remarks by talking about my mom, my mother, who had a lot to do with my interest in all of this. She was born in Springfield, Massachusetts. She happened to have been born the year women got the vote in 1920. She recalled when her mother voted for the first time and how proud she was. So that was my grandmother. And that wasn't necessarily usual. Many women were quite hesitant to actually go vote. They were nervous. What do you do? How is it? But luckily, my grandmother was very proud to go vote, and I think that translated to my mother and to me. My mother had a wonderful job after high school in Springfield, but World War II broke out, and she decided she wanted to serve her country. So despite the head of her company, which was J.W. Sickles, I believe, her president came to her and said, "Ruth, you could stay, the men are going off to war and we could promote you." And she said, "Thank you, but I really want to serve my country." So she joined the Navy and was sent to Washington, D.C., where she met my dad, who was from New York. And I grew up in Washington, but I think my mother's link to Massachusetts has always called me to come back here. So I was very pleased to come to school here and then ultimately stay. So I thank my mother for her service and for her wonderful role model she has been for me. In 2020, we will be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. All we have to do is open the newspaper or turn on the news to be reminded that this effort for women's equality is ongoing. I think it's appropriate for us to honor and celebrate the women and men who fought so hard to get the vote for at least 72 years, if not more. In order for women to obtain the vote, it took decades of persistence and dedication. And remember, it was the men who had to vote for it to make it happen. It took a while, but they got there. And that only happened with committed, dedicated, brilliant suffragists who fought relentlessly for the vote. Unfortunately, the 19th Amendment did not guarantee the vote for all women, particularly women and men of color in the Jim Crow states. And it took until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so another 45 years, to help ensure that all men and women of color could vote. And as you know, this is an ongoing issue. Access to the ballot continues to this day. This centennial is an opportunity to learn the many stories of barriers to voting that many groups face. One of our main goals is that when people learn the dramatic, violent, and endless decades of effort that it took for women to obtain the vote, that more people will appreciate and exercise their right to vote so that we could increase voter participation. There's so much history here that we were never taught. For instance, in the 1700s, women had the vote in New Jersey. It was removed in 1807. Who knew? I'd like to start this story with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, what precedes her that's also important is the Grimke sisters, who moved from the South here and were staunch abolitionists and critical to the abolition movement. They also believed in the right of women to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her upbringing is fascinating. She was born in 1815 in Johnstown, New York, and she died in 1902. Her father was Daniel Cady, a lawyer, a judge, member of the state legislature. He was elected to U.S. Congress, and finally a justice of the state Supreme Court. So this was a man who achieved greatly. When Elizabeth was growing up, he practiced law. Her father practiced law from their home, and she would go listen to him. She would learn from him, from hearing him with clients talk about the law. And she became outraged at the law with respect to women. She learned how women did not have basic property rights. There's a story about how her father had given her a treasured coral necklace. And we know that in those days, a woman might have one piece of jewelry that was her only set of pearls or necklace. This was her favorite coral necklace. And her friends teased her, particularly the boys, because they would remind her that, you know, Elizabeth, when you get married, that coral necklace will belong to your husband. And he could take the necklace, he can sell it. He could go sell it for tobacco. He could smoke it up. And she was so outraged at the thought that she wouldn't own it any longer if and when she got married. There's a story of her being so outraged by that one day she walked into her father's law office, his study in their home, with a pair of scissors. And her father asked her, what are you doing with a pair of scissors? And she said, I'm going to cut up all of these outrageous laws right here and now because they're ridiculous. And he had to explain to her that there were copies of these laws all over the state of New York, and that she would need to learn how to go to Albany, New York, and the legislature to change the laws. And that was how she learned some of those processes. When Elizabeth did get married to Henry Brewster Stanton, their honeymoon was to go to England for the World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840 in London. It was an abolitionist convention, but the convention refused to recognize American women or other women as delegates. And they had crossed the ocean to come to this convention and were told that they couldn't vote. They would have to be seated separately. William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist from Massachusetts, also attended the convention. And when he learned that women were not recognized as delegates, he was outraged. He was so outraged that he gave up his vote and he sat with the women, which was pretty amazing. Another woman at this convention is our own Lucretia Mott of Nantucket, who met Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the convention, and then they became fast friends. And they vowed at the World Anti-Slavery Conference to hold a convention for women's rights. Life intervened. 8 years later, they met. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was living in Seneca Falls. Lucretia Mott came to visit her sister, I believe, who was having a baby in Seneca Falls. They reunited, and within just a few days, they decided to put together a convention, which was pretty amazing. Elizabeth Cady Stanton this was 1848, so the convention in England was in 1840, we're now in 1848, they're creating the Seneca Falls Convention. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was asked to draft their wish list. She was highly educated, and I'll just mention that when she grew up, she had brothers, but she was always much more interested and more academic than they were. And her father would say to her, "Oh, if only you were a boy," which was, of course, devastating to her, and she kept trying to win his approval. That was something that she desperately wanted. She was very highly educated. She was asked to come up with a draft of their wish list. She called it the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Sentiments begins by asserting the equality of all men and women and reiterates that both genders are endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It argues that women are oppressed by the government and the patriarchal society of which they are a part. It included the votes for women. Lucretia Mott and some others were opposed. They were sort of horrified, like, votes for women, that's asking for too much. It will jeopardize all of the other things on the list. We need to wait. Something that I think we can all, resonates with all of us is hearing, it's not yet time, you need to wait. Frederick Douglass was in attendance, and he agreed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and he helped her convince the convention that they should adopt votes for women. When they took a vote at the convention, and by the way, there were 240 attendees, 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiments. The only item that was not unanimously adopted was votes for women, which foretold how difficult this was going to be if among these people, these women in particular, these men who were in favor of equality for women, didn't feel comfortable supporting that part of the Declaration of Sentiments. Not long after that, Elizabeth decided to go to Albany to lobby for the vote. Her father was a justice of the New York Supreme Court, was appalled, and he was certain that he would be embarrassed by her efforts. So he forbade her from going and threatened to cut her off from the family. She went anyway, doing what she believed was right and risking so much. The irony, of course, is that despite his very distinguished career, it was she who made the mark in history, and he is known as her father. We fast forward a little bit to Worcester 2 years later, October 23rd and 24th in 1850. And this was the first national women's rights convention with 1,000 delegates, 11 states, and for 2 days in Worcester. Lucretia Mott from Nantucket and Lucy Stone, both of Massachusetts, were the leaders of this effort. And it took place for 2 years in Worcester, 1850 and 1851. In 1852, it was in Syracuse, New York, presided over by Lucretia Mott. And then it was held elsewhere, a national women's rights convention, every year for 10 years total. Amelia Bloomer is a name that you might be familiar with. She attended the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. As you may recall, she popularized bloomers, pantaloons over shorter dresses, Now, up until that time, women had been wearing dresses all the way to the ground. They would drag them on the ground as they walked. I can't imagine how much effort it took to keep them clean, how cumbersome they were, how hard it was to move around. So pantaloons were developed, and Amelia Bloomer popularized them. So they wore them to these events, and they had a long tunic over it and then bloomers at the bottom, so they didn't drag on the ground. They could move more freely. But guess what happened? They drew jeers and scorn from men and boys and became a distraction when they gave speeches. Does this sound familiar? Clothing for women being a distraction. So they stopped wearing them, and that includes speeches given by Susan B. Anthony. Speaking of which, Amelia Bloomer should be famous for something in addition to promoting bloomers for women. Bloomer introduced Susan B. Anthony, who was 31 at the time, to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was 35, in May 1851 in Seneca Falls. They were all together at the Second Women's Rights Convention in Worcester in the fall of 1851. At the Worcester Convention, they demanded the right to vote, to own property. Now, how many of you remember when women couldn't get a credit card in her own name? Right? That's something that many of us remember. You couldn't get a credit card without your husband signing for it with you. To be admitted to higher education, ministry, the ministry, and other professions. Many newspapers heaped scorn on the convention. Although a few newspapers, such as the Massachusetts Spy, whose editor was the husband of one of the main convention supporters, that one published positive reports about the convention, but most reports were scornful and hostile. The New York Herald, edited by a strong opponent of the women's movement, made fun of the speaker's appearance, demeanor, and words. Sound familiar? The Herald summed up what it called, quote, the actual designs of that piebald assemblage called the Women's Rights Convention this way: they want to abolish the Bible. Now, it was later that Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually wrote a non-sexist version of the Bible, but she didn't want to abolish the Bible, just make it gender neutral. Abolish the Constitution, they claimed, and the laws of the land. Reorganize society upon a social platform of perfect equality in all things of sexes and colors, as if that were horrid. Newspapers across the nation echoed the Herald's mocking tone, but the Worcester Convention was an early case of all press is good press, because the satirical articles and the insurrection of petticoats drew attention to the women's rights movement and helped win converts to the cause. August 8, 2018 was Lucy Stone's 200th birthday, and we unveiled her display panel at our Women's Equality Day event at the Swan Boats. And I'm sorry, I don't have a copy of that one here. These are copies. But please do go on our website, suffrage100ma.org, and under Did You Know, I think it is, we have the panel project and all of the panels listed, and you can enlarge them and read in detail. Lucy Stone was born in West Brookfield 200 years ago last August, and in 1847, she was the first woman from Massachusetts to earn a college degree. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony and 15 other women voted in Rochester, New York, in a national election, but they were arrested, and only Anthony was put on trial, and she was found guilty by the judge, who decided the case himself, even though it was a jury trial. Susan B. Anthony's speech and her courage was a turning point in how people viewed her, and she became greatly respected for her courage in doing that. In 1879, women in Massachusetts obtained the right to vote in school board elections. And in 1900, women were on the school committees in Beverly and Salem, and that happened as well around the rest of the state. I want to mention Leslie Cutler from Needham, and I'm sure there are others from Wellesley as well, Leslie Cutler became one of the first women elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, and then I believe the second woman elected to the Massachusetts Senate. And what's interesting is she was in office until 1969, and then it was David Locke, who many of you may recall, became the state senator then after her. So I'm going to backtrack a little. The late 1800s, big issue was that initially Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucy Stone worked together on suffrage. But there was a split during after the Civil War, and over the organizations, the big issue was whether or not to support giving only black men the right to vote. Prior to that, all of the efforts had been for universal suffrage, for all men and women to get the right to vote. But unfortunately, there was a split and an effort for the 13th and 14th Amendments that would give only black men the right to vote. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony did not want to support that. They were holding strong to no, this should be for everyone. Lucy Stone worked very hard to obtain the vote for black men, and that was a split with Frederick Douglass as well. Later they came together, but it was a very rough time at that point. So I want to, and there had been rival organizations, and they reconciled and merged in 1890 as the National American Woman Suffrage Association, with Susan B. Anthony as its leading voice. Because time is short, I want to try to get to 1920, and there's so much to cover. I'm going to fast forward. One thing that's important is that by 1900, the only states that had adopted suffrage, because the effort stemming from the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls and the National Women's Rights Convention around women voting had been a two-pronged effort to go state by state by state, and or to get a constitutional amendment through Congress. The main effort, most of it had been state by state, but by 1900, there were only, I believe it was 9 states that had adopted suffrage for women, and they were all west of the Mississippi. Now, why is that? Wyoming, why was that? Because the states in the West wanted to encourage women to move west. And they said, oh, you want the vote? We'll give you the vote. So women obtained the votes in those states, partly because they were interested in attracting women to come move west. But it was pretty appalling by 1900 that no states east of the Mississippi had adopted women's suffrage. I'm going to fast forward a little bit to 1912. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Suffragette with Meryl Streep, Carrie Mulligan, and Helena Bonham Carter. And that movie is also on our website listed that you could see it. Now, that was the first film about the suffrage movement ever portrayed on a full screen in the movie theaters. The only other time women's suffrage was portrayed on a big screen was in Mary Poppins. And for some of us, we can remember the song, and yes, Mrs. Banks was in favor of women's suffrage, and she was a suffragette, but she was also a caricature, and I can't say that all of that was very positive about the suffrage movement, and it certainly didn't reflect the horror that these women had to go through and were fighting for to get the vote. So the Suffragette movie came out, and Emmeline Pankhurst is played by Meryl Streep. And what's important, this group, there were suffragists, ISTS, in the United States, in Europe, in England. In England, this group led by Emmeline Pankhurst became violent. Her creed was deeds, not words, like enough talking. We've been at this for 50 or so years, enough talking, and they did become violent, and they would blow up buildings and throw rocks. And they became more violent, and the papers, to make fun of them, dubbed them the suffragettes, as if to make fun of them. But they said, fine, we'll take it. So the British women who were more violent became the suffragettes. The rest of the movement were still the suffragists, ISTS, and in the United States, they were the suffragists. And I think it may have been the movie that popularized the word suffragette, but really the American women were suffragists. In that movie, which depicts the British story, and I highly, highly recommend it. I think you can stream it. It's a few years old. We did it as an event for us, which was great. But in that movie, there's an American woman who is not portrayed. Her name is Alice Paul. Have any of you ever heard of Alice Paul? Very few. I have a few. Alice, I had not either until I started studying all this. Alice Paul was incredibly important, and I'll talk about her a little bit more this morning. And although she is not depicted in the movie, Alice Paul's from New Jersey. She was going for a graduate degree in around 1912, which is in and of itself amazing, to England. And she was studying in England. She was a Quaker who was brought up with the notion of equality. So when she went to England, I think it was Emmeline Pankhurst's daughter, Christabel, was giving a speech on the campus where Emmeline was studying, and she went to this speech on campus and was enthralled and became a suffragist and later a suffragette because of that. And in the movie where you see what women went through, being jailed and force-fed and so forth, Alice Paul herself was a part of that, but it's not depicted. She is depicted in what was an HBO movie, so it was never on the big screen, but HBO did an incredible movie in about 2005 called Iron-Jawed Angels, and that is the story of Alice Paul and also Lucy Burns. And it's interesting, at the beginning of the movie, Alice Paul has just returned from England with another woman, Lucy Burns, who she met in England, who was also an American. And the sort of, you could call them the old guard, the women who had been at suffrage work for decades, met with them, and the first thing they said to them is, we don't want any of that violent stuff from England. They didn't want these women coming back with their more violent training to use that here. And they promised, and they were nonviolent, but they were certainly more activist than the suffrage movement had been. And the first thing that she wanted to do, one of the major things, was she wanted to have a parade. She was able to get them to enable her to be head of a congressional committee in Washington. And in March 3rd, 1913, there was a very famous parade. She scheduled it to coincide with Woodrow Wilson being sworn in as president. He was arriving in Washington for his inauguration. He arrives with his wife at Union Station and looks to his wife and says, where is everybody? Like, people weren't there. He expected throngs of people. And they said, oh, they're at the suffrage parade, at the women's parade. So she had scheduled this enormous parade. There were 6,000 to 8,000 women who participated in the parade, and thousands of spectators in town who also went to the parade. For the majority of the parade, it was peaceful. But at some point, it became not peaceful, where young men and other men started throwing things at the women, and pandemonium broke out, and people were injured, and about 100 ended up in the hospital from the violence. There were rowdy, and many were drunk, and there was not enough police protection, and those that were there ignored what was going on. It made the front page of the newspaper. Alice considered it a victory. We had made it to the front page of the paper. More people will know about this issue. But the old guard didn't like it. They thought this was horrible. It was terrible news for them. So that sort of reflected some of the strains, if you will, the challenges between the old guard and this new group. I will mention during that parade that, and it's in the movie as well, there's a woman named Ida B. Wells, whom many of you may know of, and you may have heard of her from her anti-lynching work. She was an African-American woman, brilliant, and a brilliant speaker and activist. And one of her issues was suffrage. She fought for women's suffrage. And she knew about the parade and asked Alice Paul if she could participate. And Alice Paul said, yes, but you have to be in the back. Now, they were very worried about the Southern vote. It was a terrible position to be in. But Ida B. Wells, despite that, slipped in and marched with her delegation from Illinois because she felt strongly, I'm either going to march with my delegation or I'm not going to march at all. She's a very famous woman who did tremendous things, I think, in the Reconstruction piece that's on PBS now. She's included in that, did enormous amount of work, and I'm very pleased that the the Massachusetts Black Women's Association does an annual Ida B. Wells tea, which I've been pleased to go with, and Mercedes as well. It's a terrific tea to do every year. So it's important that this centennial celebrate all the women and men who worked so hard for suffrage, including African American women and others of color. Back to the story, Alice Paul and the suffragists. Another activist piece that she thought of and implemented was to picket the White House. Nobody had ever picketed the White House. That was her idea. And women picketed the White House. They became the silent sentinels. They stood out front in the cold weather. They stood on bricks that were warm to stay warm, and with huge signs and banners. And a big issue happened when World War I broke out. And then it became, well, will you picket a sitting president? Which at the time was a huge question, a huge issue. And she decided, yes, we should still continue to picket. And because of that, and prior to that, they had not bothered them, but at that point they did. Many women ended up jailed, and they would go on hunger strikes. And Alice Paul was an incredible leader with this, and when she ended up going to jail herself, she gave to the others incarcerated strength and courage to hold strong. I'm wearing my jailhouse pin that others from the Women's Suffrage Celebration Coalition are wearing. These pins were designed in England, and the idea was that they knew that men who went to war wore uniforms, and they received badges and banners to honor their service. And the suffragists felt the same way, that we are at war. We are trying to win the vote, and it is a battle. So they wore white. They were incredible at branding, and they also awarded awards. They gave medals to the women who had survived through jail and so forth, and they designed this jail door pin in England, and then in the United States they also made it. When Alice Paul came out of the Occoquan workhouse outside of Washington, D.C., she was awarded a pin. And I will also say this was awarded to Massachusetts women. And that was because in 1919, but I'm going to pause on that for a minute because I want to fill in. We were at the suffragists, we were at 1913 with the parade. 1914 and 1915 were big years here in Massachusetts. I will mention that the first anti-suffrage efforts, unfortunately, began in Massachusetts. It did begin here, and it was large. In 1914 and 1915, there were 2 years where the pro-suffragists had parades, and they were working towards a referendum that was also in November of 1915. So to build support for voting for women's suffrage, they created 2 parades. One in 1914, these were both in Boston. I think one was down Tremont Street. The 1915 one was in Back Bay. So to give you a comparison by size, the Women's March in January of 2017, many of you may have been there, January 2017, the Women's March in Boston, 175,000 people attended that march, which was amazing. I don't think I'd ever seen that many people on the Boston Common in downtown Boston, 175,000 people. In 1915, they had this parade in Back Bay where there were 500,000 spectators. That's enormous. And 12 to 15,000 marchers. There was half the population, no email, no cell phones, no texting, no whatever. So it was just amazing that they pulled that off. And the year before, in 1914, there were 200,000 to 300,000 people. So it was just an enormous feat, and incredibly clearly among the 500,000 were antis as well, but obviously many pro-suffrage people. And 1 month later, despite that, It was defeated at the ballot box in November of 1915. And that was an effort in Massachusetts to change our Constitution. New York also tried in 1915, and it failed. New York tried again in 1917, and they got it. And New York was the first state east of the Mississippi to win suffrage votes for women. So that was an enormous time. I'll mention that in February of 1919, so New York got the vote in 1917. February 1919, Woodrow Wilson is in Europe. He's on his way back from World War I negotiations. He thought about going to New York, but he knew that the suffragists would greet him there. And the issue then was, okay, fine, we got New York, but the rest of the country still isn't voting. So there's still an even stronger effort to focus on the 19th Amendment, including here in Massachusetts, because here had been this enormous effort to focus on voting in Massachusetts, and it had failed. So now the focus became on the constitutional amendment. One thing I will mention in Massachusetts that they used was a bluebird. It became a symbol of women's suffrage, and they were put across the state. I believe the Needham Historical Society has one, perhaps Wellesley does as well, but that's something we may bring out again as part of our celebration. So 1919, Woodrow Wilson is coming back from Europe. He decides to come to Boston. That's where he's going to land. And Alice Paul came up from Washington, D.C., and greeted his boat with 22 women suffragists. Now there's a National Women's Party office. That was Alice Paul had started the National Women's Party, and they now had a Boston office right next to the Boston Common. And they greeted his boat, and then there was a parade. I find this interesting. In February of 1919, there was an outdoor parade. I don't know what the weather was then, but it might have been a little chilly. And 22 women protested him, and they were arrested for doing so. And 17 or so, I have to check my notes, were jailed. And they were sent to the Charles Street jailhouse. And what happened then after this, those women turned out to have been the last women jailed in the country for suffrage, and they did receive these pins, were given to them in a ceremony. The granddaughter of one of those women is Pamela Swing, and she's at Brandeis. She's a scholar at Brandeis, and she wrote a play about women being jailed and the Boston situation. Her grandmother also was picketed and was jailed in Washington and served time in Algonquin. And in honor of the February 24, 1919 arresting and picketing and so forth at the State House in Boston, the Women's Suffrage Celebration Coalition, in conjunction with Brandeis University and the Boston Women's Heritage Trail, another terrific group, together we put on an event at the State House, and it was a reading of the play in costume. There are pictures of that on our website under events, and I encourage you to do that. And the group that performed is called We Did It For You, and that's a terrific group. It's an amateur group. They've written a wonderful play about women's history that I encourage you to find as well. So February 1919, the women were jailed, and that was protesting Woodrow Wilson because they wanted to encourage him to lobby Congress. And women had been meeting with him for years to encourage him to please encourage Congress to pass the suffrage amendment. And finally, it happened in June of 1919. And once it was adopted, Massachusetts became the 8th state to ratify, because it's adopted by Congress. Now it needs to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Massachusetts was the 8th state to ratify. And on your materials, you'll see that we have an upcoming centennial celebration. It's a kickoff event at Faneuil Hall on the anniversary of that, which is June 25, 2019. Will be 100 years since Massachusetts was the 8th state to ratify. And we're having an event at Faneuil Hall to celebrate that, with the Boston Children's Chorus and a woman named Judith Colora, who has a company called History at Play, is putting together a terrific play for us with actors, with professional actors, to tell this whole story. So I encourage you to come. It's from 5 to 7, and we will be putting that on our website. There'll be an Eventbrite, so you can reserve. It will be free and open to the public, but we would really appreciate RSVPs for that. So, and I think some of you may have a flyer about that. So once Massachusetts had ratified, and you get to the next year, so that was June 2019, but we didn't get the vote till August. So what happened in between? States were voting on it, up, down, and so forth, and they were down to needing one more state. Florida and North Carolina were clearly unfavorable. Vermont, Connecticut, and Tennessee were the 3 states left where it might be possible. There was intense lobbying everywhere at the Republican convention, everywhere. And there were legal opinions, and they were encouraging President Wilson to encourage the governor of Tennessee. And finally, the governor of Tennessee agreed to hold a vote. That alone was major. So the governor of Tennessee agreed to hold the vote. Carrie Chapman Catt is someone you may have heard of. She was a suffragist, and later started, not later actually, in February of 2020, started the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters, as many of you know, grew out of the suffrage movement. There was an organization, and the women recognized that women would need help voting, that they might be nervous about it, that they would want education, they would want to feel empowered to do so. So Carrie Chapman Catt and others created the League of Women Voters. Now, Carrie Chapman Catt was wearing both hats. She was still a suffragist, and she went to Tennessee to lobby. She expected to be there for a week. She packed bags for a week. She stayed for 2 months because of the extensive lobbying that was going on in Tennessee. It was unbelievable. The temperance movement, which I haven't even talked about, was a huge piece of this effort. And there were many corporations that were opposed to women getting the vote. And there was incredible lobbying for days. So there were several days of voting on the motions. The vote was expected to tie on the last day. Harry Burns was a 24-year-old first-term Republican wearing a red flower in opposition to women getting the vote. Women wore yellow roses if they were supporting suffrage, or men, rather, wore yellow roses, also the legislators. While he was on the floor of the House, he received a message from his mother encouraging him to vote for suffrage. Now, he had apparently already been on the fence, if you will, and his mother's note helped him. And he changed his vote. Despite his red rose, when they called the roll call, he voted in favor. The place went in total pandemonium. The story is he had to escape through a window. He was, of course, concerned he would never be reelected again. He was reelected. The governor, however, was not. So it was a very interesting time. But that is how that last vote happened. And I was pleased a year ago at the John F. Kennedy Library, where they have Profile and Courage Awards, that a young student won the award for writing about Harry Burns. And I had received a call from the director there who had wondered, had I heard of Harry Burns? And I was so excited that Harry Burns was getting the recognition that he deserved. I'll also mention that the Yellow Roses is a name that's attached to one of our partners. The WSCC has partner organizations. We do not charge. We're up to about 80 that are on the back of your handout, and these are organizations far and wide, the Girl Scouts, the League of Women Voters, ADL, all kinds of various groups. And one of the groups is the Yellow Roses, and those were a group of students. When they were in 7th grade, they watched the movie Iron Jawed Angels at school and went to their advisor and asked him if they could organize and do something. And they ended up creating a group called the Yellow Roses, after the women who fought for suffrage. But they wanted something to fight for today. And they have landed on fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment. The amazing thing about that is Alice Paul, who I was talking about, in 1923, after women had obtained the vote in 1920, she drafted the first version of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. She lived until the late 70s to see it get introduced and to know that it had gone partially through and that many states had ratified it but passed away, not knowing whether it was going to pass. And as you know, it never did pass. And that amendment, I believe, like the Prohibition Amendment, are the only two constitutional amendments adopted by Congress that include language with a limiting time that say this must be adopted by such and such a time, and then it will expire. And that has never been tested as to whether that is even constitutional. But it was included, and that's why today there are still efforts to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. One more state is needed, but it's in question even if they do pass it because of this language in the Constitution. I'm going to wrap up here soon. I just want to mention a couple of other things. The WSCC was formed in 2010 to celebrate the 90th anniversary of women getting the vote. We screened the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, which is about Alice Paul, starring Hilary Swank and Angelica Houston. It was an HBO movie, so in order to get that, you have to get it on YouTube. Or to get a DVD, they're at the libraries, and the League of Women Voters and the WSCC distributed copies of Iron-Jawed Angels to all of the high schools in Massachusetts several years ago. In 2011, we did an event at the Swan Boats, and I'll tell one more story. I know time is getting short. At the Swan Boats, because Mayor Menino, may he rest in peace, who was alive then, wanted to honor the Swan Boat family, and we wanted to honor women obtaining the vote. The actual date is August 26 of 1920, when Tennessee finally adopted it, and then it was inserted into the Constitution on August 26. And Bella Abzug, when she was in Congress, got it passed that August 26 be designated Women's Equality Day. So we celebrate Women's Equality Day almost every year at the Swan Boats, but we learned a feminist story about the Swan Boats. Who knew? Because Richard Paget in the late 1800s came up with this idea to build a boat that would have a swan that would hide the paddle wheels where you sit and paddle the boat. He built a small one. He got licensed to run it. He did it for 1 year, and then he suddenly passed away, leaving his wife with 4 children and no income. And she decided she would run the business. The business community in Boston was not in favor of a woman running a company. So they made her get signatures and jump through all kinds of hoops, but she persisted for 30 years. And her great-grandchildren run it today. Lynn Paget and her cousin Phil are running the Swan Boat. So they had pictures of Julia Paget up. And it's a wonderful story. It's now included in a more recent book they've put out. It's a children's book about the Swan Boats, and the story is included, which is wonderful. So with that, I want to be sure that I've covered all the topics that are important to us. But I'm happy to open it up for questions, and I thank you so much for inviting me here today.
I'm told that about 1970, when Yale decided to admit women, that they were worried that the old blues might object to this. They were the donors, and they had a tradition. But they decided, in retrospect, that a lot of the old blues were grandfathers and husbands and fathers, and they realized their daughters and granddaughters could go to Yale, and so it might be a good thing. I'm wondering, back in the days when this was being debated, were there grandfathers and fathers, husbands who thought it might be a good thing to let their wives and daughters vote? How many people thought that, or was it thought as beyond the pale?
Well, eventually it required, because men were voting. It was men who were voting in each state. It was men who were voting in Congress, that those were the men who had to be convinced. And clearly there were so many opposed. And this anti-suffrage effort that started here in Massachusetts grew and grew and grew across the country. Plus there were issues around temperance. There were people who were men with the temperance movement who were opposed to temperance, who thought if women were given the vote that they would help with prohibition, and they didn't want that. So it became complicated with other issues. But the amazing thing is that despite men being brought up to think that way, and women also, just like the Phyllis Schlaflys of the world who voted against the ERA and worked so hard against the Equal Rights Amendment, there is that part of society that does not believe in equal rights for women. And they were there, but luckily they eventually saw the light. I think the amazing thing is that it came down to this one vote with Harry Burns in Tennessee, because I don't know what would have happened if he had voted against. I mean, to start this all over again. But you can tell, as Jillian mentioned, Switzerland didn't get the vote until 1972 for women. And there's a wonderful movie about that called The Divine Order, which is just a few years old, and that's also listed on our website that tells the story there. And it goes to that issue of what people believe in their heart about who should be doing what, women and men's role in society. And that all had to be overcome, and it's still, there's a trail, there's a link between what was going on prior to getting the vote to 1848 all the way and before, and through to today, frankly. But clearly, it's a huge issue, and each one of those are milestones, and it's a long story that's all related. It's all related to equality for women. Thank you for the question. Others? Yes. Did they always wear hats is the question. So in the 1920s, when it was popular to wear hats, yes, they did. I don't know prior to that. I think in the 1800s, maybe not so much. They probably always wore gloves too. That was proper. You had to wear a hat and gloves. And so that was a part of it. But I'm trying to think, in most of the parades, you will see them in hats. But they often wore white, and the gold, purple, and white are colors that were borrowed from England. Purple and white. In England, they had green. But in the United States, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were in Kansas, and they saw the sunflower and fell in love with it, and they decided to switch out the green for gold, or a bright yellow. New York, however, had green. But they were really big on branding. They understood the importance of recognizing, just like men in uniform, that women would be in uniform and they would be in white. And hats, I'm sure, were part of that for most of the time. Other questions?
It's my understanding that Frederick Lloyd Douglass got his freedom from the English suffragettes. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely.
Well, I know that he didn't have his freedom and went to England.
Yes.
And he worked closely with the suffragettes, and they actually bought his freedom for him.
I do not know if that's a wonderful story. I know there's a wonderful new huge book out about him that I hope to read, and maybe that's in there.
Yeah.
So that would be good to know, and maybe that was the beginning of his relationship, because that would have been in 1850, and 1840 and 1848 is when they were at Seneca Falls together, and Frederick Douglass was so supportive of women having the vote.
Yeah. So they were ahead of
their
time in many ways.
Yes, thank you for that question.
Well, if there are no more questions, I just want to thank you so much for being here today. It's been wonderful.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I encourage you to vote. As I said, our big hope is that by people learning more and more about this incredible effort for voting, that people will exercise their vote in greater numbers. I hope you'll join us at Faneuil Hall, and in 2020, we'll look to do a big event in Boston, but our effort is statewide, and if you could think of other organizations who might be interested in joining us, please do. And thank you so much for your interest. Have a great day.